In the dim glow of a cold New York dawn, the city looks peaceful, almost innocent. The harbor waters ripple gently against the piers, the only sound a distant foghorn cutting through the silence. But beneath this calm surface lies a truth few ever knew. Because in the darkest years of World War II, when America feared enemy sabotage and spies infiltrating its coastlines, a single man, locked behind prison walls, held the power to sway the fate of an entire nation. His name was Charles "Lucky" Luciano. And the story of how he did it is one of the most extraordinary deceptions in criminal history. Most Americans never learn the full truth. To them, Luciano was the face of organized vice, the mastermind of prostitution rings, the architect of a criminal empire that stretched like an invisible web across the country. They saw his mugshot in newspapers, read about his conviction, heard prosecutors chant his name as a symbol of corruption. The justice system had supposedly broken him. He had been sentenced to decades behind bars, stripped of power, surrounded by concrete and steel, forgotten by the world he once ruled. But in the shadows, away from the courtroom lights and public opinion, another narrative was unfolding. It began with fear. Not fear of Luciano but fear of foreign enemies. German U-boats lurked off American shorelines. Rumors of Nazi agents slipping into port cities ran rampant. A mysterious fire on board the SS Normandy in 1942 fueled panic. New York's harbor, the beating heart of the Allied supply chain, felt suddenly vulnerable. And the government, desperate for solutions, found itself turning toward an unlikely ally, the imprisoned king of the American underworld. Imagine the irony. The same system that had proudly caged him now quietly asked for his help. Navy intelligence officers visited him in secret. High-ranking officials whispered his name in closed-door meetings. They needed the Mafia's control of the docks, its covert networks, its ability to intimidate or eliminate threats without leaving a trace. But what they didn't understand, not yet at least, was that Luciano saw this moment not as cooperation, but as opportunity. A stage on which he could perform his greatest act of strategic theater. To the world he was a beaten man. To the government he was a necessary evil. But in Luciano's mind he was something else entirely. A player holding the winning hand while everyone believed he had lost the game. Prison had not destroyed him, it had sharpened him. Stripped of his empire, he had time to observe, reflect, and study people more carefully than ever. Every visitor, every guard, every whispered conversation became information. And information was power. He understood the government's fear better than they did. He sensed the cracks in their confidence, the pressure building behind their polished military fronts. He also understood the Mafia's internal anxieties, rival bosses hungry for control, soldiers uncertain about the future, old loyalties beginning to waver. Luciano recognized that the war had created a perfect environment for deception. A moment where the government needed results more than honesty, where the Mafia wanted stability more than truth, and where he alone could promise both. That promise was the seed of his deception. Even before Operation Underworld began, Luciano had been preparing mentally. Prison didn't make him small, it made his ambitions more subtle. He knew he couldn't physically enforce his power, but he could still manipulate perceptions. He could exaggerate the Mafia's influence on the docks. He could make the government believe he held exclusive control over sabotage prevention. And he could convince his mob associates that he still had extraordinary pull, even from inside his cage. This dual illusion would become his masterpiece. But for now, in this opening moment of our story, all of this remains hidden beneath the surface. What the world sees is simply a man behind bars, shifting quietly on a hard cot as a guard unlocks the prison door for a pair of government agents. They enter with official papers, stern expressions, and an air of urgency. Luciano rises slowly, deliberately, letting silence stretch just long enough to remind them he moves at his own pace. The guards step back, the room shrinks around them. The agents have come seeking cooperation. What they don't know is that Luciano has already begun calculating how to turn this request into a weapon, one pointed directly at the heart of his sentence. The conversation that follows will change the course of his life. It will also reshape the American Mafia, alter military intelligence strategies, and secure Luciano a legacy unlike any criminal in history. But in this moment, standing face to face with the government that locked him away, Luciano is calm, confident, almost amused, because he understands something the agents cannot. Power is not measured by freedom of movement but by freedom of influence. And as long as he can control perceptions, he can still control the world. This is the hidden truth behind the man. Not just a mob boss. Not just a criminal mastermind. but a strategist whose greatest weapon was not violence but deception. And it is here, in the tension-filled silence of a prison meeting room, that his greatest deception begins to unfold. Before Lucky Luciano ever took control of the American underworld, the criminal landscape of the early 20th century was a chaotic battlefield, disorganized, brutal, and constantly shifting. It was a world built on raw survival instincts, not strategy. Streets were ruled by gangs that rose and fell as quickly as the city's tides. Alliances meant nothing, betrayals were expected, and violence was the only consistent language spoken across ethnic enclaves. New York, the heart of immigrant America, was a patchwork of desperate communities, each fighting for control of blocks, docks, and opportunity. The Mafia as we imagine it today, structured, corporate, disciplined, did not yet exist. Instead, Italian crime groups operated like feudal tribes carried over from the Old World. Sicilian bosses brought with them centuries-old codes of honor, but in the crowded tenements of New York, these codes twisted into something harsher. Every neighborhood had its own small-time capo, each ruling with an iron fist and refusing to bow to anyone. Rival bosses didn't sit at conference tables. They met in alleys with knives and shotguns. The streets smelled of sweat, blood, and ambition, nothing more. Across the city, Jewish gangs, Irish gangs, and Italian gangs competed endlessly. Turf wars erupted over petty disputes. Stolen liquor shipments, gambling debts, bruised egos. Prohibition only poured gasoline on an already raging fire. The promise of fast money drew more men into the game, and with each passing year, violence grew. Shootouts became so common that New Yorkers learned to duck at the sound of a backfiring car. Politicians looked the other way as long as their pockets stayed full, and police forces, underpaid, overwhelmed, and often corrupt, struggled to keep up. For immigrants just stepping off boats from Europe, this was the reality they walked into. A world where survival required either honest labor that barely paid for bread, or a willingness to break laws and spill blood. Families struggled to feed themselves, and the American dream felt more like a distant rumor than a reachable destination. Crime wasn't just an option, it was a lifeline. In the tenements of Lower Manhattan, power shifted constantly between rival bosses who cared more about personal pride than long-term vision. Men like Giuseppe the Clutch Hand Morello, Ignazio the Wolf Lupo, and later Joe Masuria each claimed to be the most feared. They ruled through intimidation, not intelligence. Their men followed them not because they believed in strategy, but because fear was the only method these bosses understood. There was no coordination between families, no shared goals, no efficiency. The Mafia was a fractured mosaic of egos, grudges, and vendettas. The Irish controlled the docks. The Jews controlled the garment district. Italians fought among themselves so often that their strength was constantly diluted. Petty jealousies, old country feuds, and cultural divides kept them from uniting. The underworld was like a storm without direction, loud, violent, and chaotic. And then there was prohibition. When the government outlawed alcohol in 1920, it created an opportunity so massive that it rewrote the rules of crime overnight. Suddenly, every gang in the city wanted a piece of the multi-million-dollar bootlegging trade. Speakeasies sprouted like weeds. Smuggled whiskey flowed through secret tunnels and hidden warehouses. But instead of organizing themselves to meet the demand, the gangs did what they always did. They fought. Bodies piled up faster than barrels of liquor. Bars changed ownership at gunpoint. Truckloads of bootleg rum were hijacked weekly. The city descended deeper into lawless disorder. And while all of this chaos unfolded, politicians treated crime like a game they could bend to their advantage. City Hall was a revolving door of bribes, deals, and backroom conversations. Corruption seeped through every level of government. Racketeering thrived because the police often worked hand in hand with the criminals they were sworn to pursue. Judges were bought, juries intimidated, and the justice system bowed under the weight of its own hypocrisy. In this volatile landscape, where power changed hands with the pull of a trigger, trust was non-existent. No boss could maintain control for long. No gang could build an empire without losing it to treachery or violence. New York was bursting with opportunity, yet too fractured to seize it efficiently. The criminal world needed structure. It needed innovation. It needed someone who could see beyond personal grudges and turf lines. Someone who understood money, influence, psychology, and the importance of unity. That person had not yet arrived. At least, not in full force. While the city tore itself apart, a young man named Salvatore Lucania, later known as Lucky Luciano, was watching, absorbing, learning. He observed how violence wasted resources. He studied how corruption could be leveraged more effectively. He saw how cultural divides weakened the Italian syndicates. He recognized something others didn't: crime could be a business. A well-run, well-funded, disciplined business. Something predictable. Something scalable. Something that could outgrow the streets and seep into unions, politics, ports, and corporations. But before Luciano could change the underworld itself had to reach a breaking point. And by the mid-1920s, it did. The constant bloodshed, the relentless power struggles, the foolish pride of old-world bosses. Everything pushed the Mafia closer to collapse. No one had control. No one could bring order. No one had the vision to unite these competing factions into something greater. America was becoming modern. Industry was becoming modern. Cities were becoming modern. But crime was still stuck in the past. And in that gap between the old world and the new, a vacuum of power formed. A vacuum waiting for someone bold enough, ruthless enough, and intelligent enough to seize it. A vacuum waiting for Lucky Luciano. Salvatore Lucania's early life was a study in survival. Born in 1897 in Lercara, Sicily, he arrived in New York as a small boy, carried across the Atlantic by a family seeking opportunity but landing in a world far harsher than any they had imagined. The streets of East Harlem were alive with noise, smells, and danger. Crowded tenements pressed together like stacked blocks, alleys twisting like veins through the city. Poverty was everywhere, and it didn't ask permission. It didn't forgive mistakes. Every day, survival was a battle, and every child learned quickly that strength and cunning often mattered more than honesty or education. Luciano's family was working class, trying desperately to make ends meet. His father labored long hours in menial jobs, his mother struggled to feed her children, and young Salvatore grew up keenly aware of the fragility of their existence. But even amid scarcity he noticed patterns, small openings where cleverness, audacity, and the willingness to break rules created advantages. He saw men walking with confidence, demanding respect not because they were wealthy, but because they had cultivated fear and loyalty around them. From them, he learned the first lessons of influence. Power is psychological as much as it is physical, and perception often outweighs reality. School offered little refuge. In overcrowded classrooms, teachers were overworked, children were unruly, and discipline was sporadic. Young Salvatore, with a sharp mind and sharper instincts, quickly realized that survival required adapting to environments far larger and more complex than himself. He began spending time on the streets, where he observed other boys hustling, running small cons, stealing goods, and carving out niches for themselves. Here he discovered the foundations of strategy, not just in surviving but in manipulating others, assessing risks, and knowing when to act and when to wait. By adolescence, Salvatore had earned a reputation as both clever and daring. He gravitated toward the neighborhood gangs that dominated East Harlem. They were small but organized, moving contraband, running errands for local racketeers, and learning quickly how to blend intimidation with negotiation. Luciano understood instinctively that the streets were a microcosm of the larger world he would one day control. Power existed not merely in brute force but in influence, perception, and timing. He watched older gang members, studied their mistakes, and began crafting his own approach, one that would emphasize calculation over chaos and cunning over simple aggression. At the same time, the city itself offered lessons in economics and opportunity. Bootlegging, gambling dens, and illicit gambling operations flourished under prohibition. The streets were alive with transactions that skirted legality but demanded precision. Luciano absorbed every detail. He learned that money could be moved silently, loyalties could be bought, and influence could extend far beyond immediate territory. He also learned the value of alliances, how partnerships, when carefully managed, could provide protection and amplify power far more effectively than individual violence ever could. Luciano's rise was accelerated by his willingness to embrace risk in ways others avoided. Unlike older bosses clinging to old-world traditions, he did not shy away from working with non-Italians, Jews, or anyone capable of furthering his goals. In a city divided by ethnicity and old grudges, this flexibility gave him a strategic advantage. While others relied solely on fear or familial ties, Luciano was building networks, linking people who traditionally would never collaborate, and creating channels that would become the backbone of his empire. Violence, of course, was never far from his path. The streets demanded a demonstration of strength, and Luciano learned quickly how to wield it selectively. He did not act rashly. He observed, waited, and struck with precision. Each confrontation taught him lessons in human behavior, hierarchy, and the importance of timing. But unlike many of his contemporaries, he paired these lessons with restraint. He understood that unnecessary bloodshed created chaos, distracted from opportunity and attracted unwanted attention. By combining calculated aggression with diplomacy, he began establishing himself as a figure others respected and feared. By the early 1920s, Luciano had transitioned from a streetwise teenager to a young man recognized as a rising star within the Italian criminal community. He had survived attempts on his life, outmaneuvered rivals, and built relationships that would serve as his foundation. But perhaps most importantly, he had developed a psychological edge. He understood people's ambitions, weaknesses, and desires in ways few others could. He could read a man's hesitation, exploit his fears, and craft strategies that made others act according to his design. While many of his peers relied on brute strength alone, Luciano relied on intellect and manipulation, a combination that would define his entire career. His ambition was matched only by his vision. While the streets were fragmented and chaotic, Luciano saw potential for order. He envisioned a system in which disputes could be managed, profits maximized, and power consolidated, not through constant bloodshed but through organization. To him, the Mafia could be more than a collection of violent gangs. It could operate like a business, with structure, hierarchy, and coordinated influence extending far beyond the immediate city. This mindset separated him from other young gangsters, setting the stage for his eventual transformation of organized crime in America. Luciano's personal life mirrored his street philosophy. He maintained a calm, composed exterior, rarely revealing the full depth of his thoughts or ambitions. Friends and rivals alike underestimated him at first, seeing only a sharp-tongued, street-smart youth. But beneath that exterior lurked a strategist capable of orchestrating operations, predicting outcomes, and exploiting the weaknesses of both allies and enemies. Each interaction became a test, each conversation a move on a psychological chessboard. The young Luciano had already begun mastering the art of control, not through fear alone but through perception, information, and influence. By the time he entered adulthood, Salvatore Lucania had become more than a survivor of the streets. He had become a strategist, a thinker, and a rising force who understood that power was cultivated as much in the mind as it was in the fists. He had tasted the rules of violence, the lessons of betrayal, and the calculus of loyalty. And he was ready to step into a world that had never seen a mind like his before, a world that would soon be reshaped, forever, by the man the world would come to know as Lucky Luciano. By the mid-1920s, the streets of New York were a battlefield, fragmented and chaotic, but Salvatore Lucky Luciano had begun to see a way to bring order out of chaos. Unlike his contemporaries, he did not desire merely to dominate his neighborhood or outshoot his rivals. He envisioned something far grander. He imagined an empire not defined by fleeting violence, but by structure, efficiency, and influence. A criminal enterprise that could operate like a corporation, complete with strategy, hierarchy, and long-term vision. To most, this idea would have seemed impossible. The Mafia was a loose collection of small gangs, driven by pride, tradition, and personal vendettas. But Luciano had learned that chaos could be tamed if approached with intelligence and foresight. The first step in building this empire was eliminating inefficiency. For decades, the Italian underworld had been mired in pointless conflicts. Gang wars erupted over minor slights or territorial disputes, leaving bodies in the streets but no lasting power gained. Luciano recognized that such reckless violence weakened the community as a whole. He began orchestrating a methodical consolidation, quietly negotiating with rivals and allies alike. Instead of acting as a lone enforcer, he positioned himself as a mediator, a strategist capable of uniting competing factions. He cultivated relationships with influential figures like Meyer Lansky, Benjamin Bugsy Siegel, and Frank Costello, men who understood money, organization, and strategy. Together, they would form the backbone of what would later become a structured national syndicate. Luciano's genius lay not merely in forging alliances but in redefining the rules of engagement. Violence was no longer an end in itself. It became a tool, applied with precision and calculation. He developed a hierarchy that mirrored a corporate structure. Capos managed crews, crews managed operations, and operations were overseen by a council. At the top of this hierarchy, Luciano positioned himself not as a tyrant who demanded fear-driven loyalty, but as a strategist who could coordinate vast operations while minimizing unnecessary conflict. Each subordinate understood the benefits of cooperation, and each rival understood the consequences of challenging the system. One of Luciano's most significant innovations was the creation of the Mafia Commission. Before him, Italian crime families operated independently, governed by tradition and local feuds. There was no central authority, no council to arbitrate disputes, and no mechanism to prevent internecine warfare. Luciano saw the problem clearly. Without centralized governance, the underworld was doomed to endless cycles of bloodshed. He proposed a revolutionary solution, a governing council composed of representatives from all major families, designed to mediate disputes, coordinate criminal enterprises, and maintain stability. This was more than a power move, it was a structural reform that transformed organized crime into an institution capable of long-term dominance. The process of building this empire required careful psychological manipulation. Luciano understood that loyalty could not be commanded solely through fear. While fear ensured compliance, it did not cultivate cooperation or strategic thinking. He paired intimidation with opportunity, offering ambitious underlings a chance to rise within the ranks if they adhered to the rules of the system. He demonstrated his power with calculated acts of violence, each designed to send a message, and simultaneously rewarded those who proved loyal and competent. Through this combination of carrot and stick, he created a network of operatives bound by ambition, respect, and necessity. Luciano also demonstrated extraordinary skill in bridging cultural divides. Unlike many of his peers who clung rigidly to Sicilian traditions and mistrusted outsiders, Luciano was willing to collaborate with non-Italians. Meyer Lansky, a Jewish mobster, became one of his closest advisors and operational partners. Together, they forged alliances that transcended ethnicity, creating a more cohesive, efficient, and powerful organization. Luciano recognized that rigid tribalism limited potential. By embracing flexibility, he expanded his influence into areas that had previously been closed to him. The economic foundations of Luciano's empire were equally sophisticated. He understood that money was the lifeblood of power. Prohibition provided a lucrative starting point, but he saw potential far beyond bootlegging. Gambling, loan sharking, prostitution, labor rackets, and eventually narcotics all became part of a coordinated strategy to generate revenue streams and reinforce influence. Each enterprise was managed carefully, with layers of oversight designed to minimize risk and maximize profit. Luciano treated crime like a business, implementing systems that allowed operations to continue smoothly even if he was absent or imprisoned. Strategic use of violence reinforced this system. Luciano's approach was never indiscriminate. Rather than reacting impulsively to slights or challenges, he planned each act to produce maximum effect. Eliminations were selective and calculated, designed to consolidate power, enforce loyalty, or remove obstacles. The infamous Castellammarese War, which engulfed the New York Mafia from 1929 to 1931, became a turning point. Luciano orchestrated a series of alliances, betrayals, and targeted hits that ultimately overthrew older bosses like Joe Masuria and Salvatore Maranzano. By doing so, he demonstrated both tactical brilliance and strategic patience. The war was brutal, but it cleared the path for his vision of a unified, modernized mafia. In the aftermath of the war, Luciano's consolidation was complete. The commission now governed the major families, disputes were mediated through negotiation rather than spontaneous violence, and profit became the primary motivator. Under his leadership, the mafia transformed from a fragmented collection of territorial gangs into a centralized, disciplined, and highly profitable organization. Luciano's ability to balance fear, respect, and incentive created a psychological architecture as impressive as the operational one. Men followed him not only because he commanded power but because he understood their desires, fears, and ambitions better than they did themselves. By this stage, Luciano had also mastered the art of perception. Publicly, he could maintain a veneer of ordinary criminality while secretly exercising near-total control over the city's underworld. Law enforcement often focused on small infractions or sensationalized crimes, failing to grasp the structural innovations he had implemented. Meanwhile, rival gangsters underestimated his reach, believing that their local power mattered more than it did. Luciano had effectively created an empire that was invisible in its sophistication, intimidating in its scope, and nearly impossible to challenge without internal collapse. It was this combination of strategy, vision, and psychological insight that solidified Luciano's status as the architect of modern organized crime. He had not merely seized power, he had redesigned the underworld itself. The streets of New York were no longer a battlefield of chaos. They had become a carefully orchestrated machine, with Luciano at the helm, directing every component with precision. By transforming violence into a tool, loyalty into a currency, and alliances into infrastructure, he had built an empire that could endure beyond his immediate control, capable of influencing not just the city but the nation itself. Power in the Mafia was never just about guns, money, or territory. It was about loyalty, perception, and fear, a delicate balance that dictated the survival of every boss, soldier, and associate. Lucky Luciano understood this better than anyone. He grasped the psychological underpinnings of human behavior, recognizing that control was far more effective when it was invisible, subtle, and enforced by the mind rather than the fist. Central to this invisible power was the Code of Omerta, the ancient Sicilian principle of silence and loyalty. To outsiders it seemed archaic, a relic of a foreign land. But in the streets of New York, it was a tool that Luciano wielded with precision, ensuring that trust, fear, and obedience coexisted in a way that fortified his empire. Omerta demanded absolute silence about criminal activity. Betrayal was unthinkable. Revealing secrets to authorities or outsiders was tantamount to inviting death. For Luciano, this code was more than ritual, it was psychological armor. It allowed him to create an environment where men were bound not by chains or constant surveillance, but by the threat of social and professional annihilation. Fear was calibrated, it was ever-present but never arbitrary. Punishments were predictable, and loyalty became a rational choice rather than a blind obligation. Soldiers learned quickly that adherence to the code was the safest path, and deviation carried inevitable consequences. But Luciano did not rely solely on fear. He complemented the code with opportunity and reward. Competence, ambition, and reliability were recognized and elevated. A man who proved himself loyal could rise through the ranks, gaining wealth, influence, and protection. In this way, the Mafia functioned like a psychological ecosystem. Fear prevented betrayal, reward encouraged productivity, and perception of fairness maintained morale. It was a system designed to exploit basic human instincts: self-preservation, ambition, and desire for recognition. Luciano understood that these instincts could be manipulated to serve his larger strategic goals. The psychological architecture extended beyond individuals to the organization itself. Luciano recognized that power was fragile if concentrated in a single person or family. Rivalries, jealousy, and resentment could destabilize the entire network. By creating the commission, he institutionalized conflict resolution, codifying the rules of engagement and making loyalty to the organization, rather than to a single leader, the ultimate requirement. Soldiers were taught to respect the system and understand that their fates were tied to its stability. This reinforced a culture of obedience and minimized the unpredictable chaos that had previously dominated the streets. Luciano's mastery of psychological control also extended to intimidation and subtle manipulation. He cultivated a presence that suggested omnipresence and omnipotence. Rumors of his reach, whispered warnings, and strategic displays of force created a perception of absolute power. He did not need to be everywhere at once. The illusion of his oversight was sufficient. Men obeyed not because they feared immediate punishment alone, but because they believed he could see all, know all, and act decisively. In this way, perception became a weapon as powerful as any gun. The balance between loyalty and fear was delicate, and Luciano was a meticulous engineer of this balance. Executions were rare and deliberate, designed to send clear messages rather than create panic. Rewards were carefully allocated, demonstrating that loyalty was both safe and profitable. By calibrating punishment and incentive, he created a self-reinforcing loop. Men protected the organization protected them, and any deviation carried predictable consequences. This psychological system extended beyond individual families to the Mafia's network as a whole, reinforcing discipline and coherence. Luciano also understood the role of reputation in psychological control. In the underworld, reputation was currency. A boss's reputation dictated the respect of allies, the fear of rivals, and the confidence of soldiers. Luciano cultivated his reputation with precision. He demonstrated ruthlessness when necessary, intelligence at every decision point, and strategic generosity to those who proved useful. The interplay of fear, respect, and loyalty became a psychological matrix that allowed him to maintain control without constant intervention. Men followed because they believed in his competence and feared the repercussions of disobedience, creating a hierarchy that functioned efficiently and predictably. Even among his closest allies, Luciano used subtle psychological tactics to maintain dominance. He fostered a culture of controlled dependence, where key figures relied on his guidance and connections for advancement and survival. By positioning himself as the indispensable center of influence, he ensured that loyalty was not just a cultural expectation but a rational choice. This was especially evident in his dealings with figures like Meyer Lansky and Frank Costello, who were empowered yet tethered to him through shared goals, mutual benefit, and the constant awareness of his strategic acumen. The psychological architecture of Luciano's Mafia extended to interactions with law enforcement and the public. He understood that fear and influence were not limited to the streets. Newspapers, politicians, and police officers were all instruments that could be manipulated to reinforce his power. By controlling information, cultivating selective alliances, and projecting calculated images of strength or inevitability, he extended the principles of omerta and psychological control far beyond his immediate circle. Every layer of society became a terrain to manage perception, ensuring that his empire's influence remained intact even under scrutiny. Luciano's brilliance lay in integrating these psychological principles into a coherent strategy. Loyalty, fear, reputation, perception, and incentive were not isolated tools. They were components of a sophisticated system designed to maintain control over a vast and potentially chaotic network. Soldiers understood their place, allies understood their dependence, and rivals understood the consequences of opposition. The streets of New York, once fragmented and violent, now operated like a finely tuned machine, with each member's behavior calibrated to the needs of the organization. Ultimately, Luciano's manipulation of human psychology was what allowed him to achieve stability and growth where others had failed. Violence alone could not have produced the disciplined, profit-oriented, and resilient network he created. Without a deep understanding of human behavior, the Commission, and the intricate hierarchy of the Mafia, would have collapsed under the weight of ego, ambition, and fear. Luciano's true power lay not just in what he could command directly, but in the invisible influence he exerted over perception, decision-making, and loyalty. In the end, the code of omerta, fear, and loyalty was not merely a set of rules. It was a psychological framework that turned violence into strategy, intimidation into governance, and perception into power. Through this lens, Luciano was not merely a gangster. He was a master psychologist, an architect of human behavior, and a strategist capable of orchestrating an empire that extended far beyond what the eye could see. It was this understanding of the human mind, its fears, ambitions, and loyalties, that would later allow him to execute his greatest deception, convincing both the Mafia and the government of his indispensability, and cementing his place as one of the most formidable figures in criminal history. Luciano's empire was built not only on loyalty, fear, and strategic alliances but also on his extraordinary understanding of business. Crime, in his mind, was not simply a means of survival or a display of power, it was an enterprise. Every illegal operation had to be profitable, efficient, and sustainable. From gambling and prostitution to narcotics and labor rackets, Luciano transformed activities that had once been chaotic and fragmented into organized, coordinated ventures capable of generating vast wealth. He approached crime as a CEO would a corporation, analyzing risks, managing personnel, and establishing systems that ensured continuity and minimized exposure to law enforcement. Prohibition provided the initial canvas for this vision. The illegal liquor trade was chaotic before Luciano's intervention. Small gangs fought over deliveries, hijacked shipments, and engaged in turf wars that drew police attention and destabilized profits. Luciano recognized that the potential for enormous revenue existed, but only if the operation could be organized efficiently. He began negotiating control over territories and suppliers, using a combination of intimidation and diplomacy. Competitors who resisted were removed through careful, targeted violence, while those who complied were absorbed into a structured network. In this way, chaos was converted into a streamlined operation capable of generating enormous returns with minimal disruption. Gambling became another cornerstone of Luciano's empire. The operation extended from small neighborhood card games to large-scale, sophisticated betting rings. He understood that money could be moved discreetly and that profits could be maximized through careful oversight. Bookmakers, runners, and enforcers were organized into teams, each responsible for specific areas of operation. Checks and balances were introduced to ensure accountability, and payments were systematized to reduce theft and errors. Luciano's approach ensured that gambling became not just a source of income but a model for how other criminal enterprises could be managed with precision and efficiency. Prostitution was equally transformed under Luciano's direction. Unlike disorganized street-level operations, he consolidated control over multiple brothels and escort networks, establishing a hierarchy that allowed him to regulate profits and enforce discipline. Managers were appointed to oversee individual establishments, report revenues, and maintain order among employees. The operation was highly profitable, but it was also tightly controlled, minimizing exposure to law enforcement and public scandal. Luciano recognized that an enterprise could only succeed long-term if it was disciplined, accountable, and strategically managed, a principle that applied to every branch of his criminal operations. Labor racketeering became another instrument of power. Luciano understood that control over unions provided not only money but leverage over industries and politicians. Through intimidation, negotiation, and strategic alliances, he placed loyal operatives in positions of influence within docks, shipping companies, and construction firms. By doing so, he could manipulate labor disputes, secure favorable contracts, and extract payments from companies desperate to avoid disruption. The operation required both subtlety and force, and Luciano's understanding of organizational psychology allowed him to maintain control while projecting an image of inevitability and dominance. Smuggling and narcotics operations extended the empire even further. Luciano recognized opportunities beyond city limits, linking his operations to national and international networks. Goods could be transported discreetly, profits multiplied, and risks shared among trusted partners. Every shipment, every route, every contact was carefully managed. Luciano's approach was systematic. He created redundancies, ensured loyalty through incentives and fear, and maintained strict communication channels. His empire was no longer confined to the streets. It extended to ports, transportation hubs, and even the upper echelons of business and politics. Perhaps most impressively, Luciano implemented mechanisms to protect the empire from law enforcement scrutiny. He understood that public attention and police focus could destroy even the most organized operation. To mitigate risk, he used intermediaries, front businesses, and layers of bureaucracy to distance himself from criminal activity. Orders were passed through trusted lieutenants, and information was compartmentalized to ensure plausible deniability. This sophisticated approach allowed the empire to function smoothly even under the most intense scrutiny, demonstrating Luciano's foresight and strategic genius. Luciano's management style also emphasized loyalty and accountability. Each subordinate was aware that their performance and obedience directly affected their standing within the organization. Missteps were punished, but competence was rewarded. This created a culture in which men were motivated to act in the best interests of the enterprise, not merely out of fear of retribution. By combining incentives with controlled consequences, Luciano established a self-regulating system capable of sustaining growth and maintaining order even in volatile circumstances. Another key aspect of Luciano's approach was diversification. He understood that relying on a single source of income made the empire vulnerable. By spreading operations across multiple sectors, gambling, prostitution, labor rackets, smuggling, he minimized risk and created multiple revenue streams. This approach also allowed him to manipulate different markets and exploit opportunities as they arose. Luciano's strategic diversification demonstrated his understanding of both economics and human behavior. People respond to opportunity, but only a system can produce sustained profit and power. In building this empire, Luciano also demonstrated an acute awareness of timing and opportunity. He did not rush into new ventures indiscriminately. Instead, he waited for openings created by chaos, political oversight, or economic shifts. He understood the importance of patience in consolidating power. Every expansion, every alliance, every operation was carefully planned, minimizing risk while maximizing long-term gain. Unlike reckless gangsters driven by impulse, Luciano calculated each move, ensuring that growth was both sustainable and strategically advantageous. Ultimately, Luciano's empire was a reflection of his mind, organized, disciplined, and highly adaptive. He transformed criminal activity from fragmented chaos into a coherent, profitable, and resilient system. The streets of New York, once a patchwork of violent and disorganized gangs, now operated like a well-oiled machine under his guidance. Orders were clear, operations were structured, and loyalty was systematically enforced. Money flowed efficiently, power was consolidated strategically, and risk was managed intelligently. Through this combination of vision, organization, and psychological insight, Luciano turned crime into a business. But unlike legal enterprises, his operations depended not only on profit but also on control, loyalty, and the careful balance of fear and influence. By mastering the mechanics of illegal trade, he positioned himself as the unchallenged architect of the American underworld. And yet, even as his empire thrived, Luciano understood that the most important aspect of his success was not simply wealth, it was influence. The ability to manipulate systems, people, and perception would later allow him to navigate crises, negotiate with governments, and orchestrate one of the most audacious deceptions in criminal history. Even as Lucky Luciano's empire grew, he understood that power was never absolute. Every gain came with its own risks, and the higher he climbed, the more dangerous his world became. Allies could become rivals in a single whispered conversation. Friends could turn into enemies when opportunity knocked. In the Mafia, as in any world dominated by ambition and violence, loyalty was fragile, and betrayal was always lurking in the shadows. Luciano's genius lay in recognizing these dynamics early and manipulating them to his advantage, balancing relationships with allies and rivals in a way that preserved his dominance while minimizing unnecessary conflict. Among his closest allies were men like Meyer Lansky, Bugsy Siegel, and Frank Costello, figures whose ambition matched his own. Luciano nurtured these relationships carefully, giving his confidants a sense of autonomy while ensuring their dependence on his guidance and strategic vision. This allowed him to extend his influence far beyond his immediate presence. Lansky's financial acumen, Siegel's ruthless operational capabilities, and Costello's political connections complemented Luciano's vision perfectly. Each man was empowered, but their loyalty remained tethered to him, maintained through mutual benefit and the implicit understanding that Luciano was the fulcrum of power. Yet alliances in the underworld were never without tension. Rivalries simmered beneath the surface, often hidden until the right moment. The old Sicilian bosses, those clinging to tradition and personal pride, viewed Luciano's innovations with suspicion. They saw his willingness to cooperate with non-Italians, his focus on efficiency over ritual, and his consolidation of power as a threat. Bosses like Joe Masuria and Salvatore Maranzano represented both an ideological and practical obstacle. Each had loyal soldiers, each commanded respect in their communities, and each was willing to use violence to maintain their position. Navigating this treacherous landscape required a combination of diplomacy, strategic alliances, and carefully calculated force. Luciano was acutely aware of the importance of timing. Rather than confronting rivals head-on in chaotic street battles, he orchestrated alliances, leveraged enemies' weaknesses, and struck decisively when the opportunity guaranteed the maximum effect. The Castellamarese War, which erupted in 1930, was the culmination of years of tension. Masuria and Maranzano, representing opposing factions of old-world power, were locked in a brutal struggle for dominance. Luciano, younger and more adaptable, recognized that neither side could dominate the other without devastating losses. By aligning with the right allies, secretly negotiating with both sides, and plotting strategic eliminations, he positioned himself to become the ultimate victor while maintaining the illusion of neutrality until the decisive moment. Betrayal for Luciano was both a tool and a threat. He understood that trust in the Mafia was a conditional commodity, constantly tested by opportunity and fear. His ability to anticipate betrayal, by reading human behavior, analyzing motives, and monitoring alliances, allowed him to act preemptively. Friends who might turn into rivals were either neutralized, co-opted, or placated through incentives. Those who remained loyal were rewarded, ensuring that the benefits of fidelity outweighed the temptation of treachery. This careful management of human relationships created a network that was both resilient and highly responsive to Luciano's strategic direction. Enemies outside his immediate network also required skillful manipulation. Law enforcement, politicians, and competing criminal organizations all posed threats, but Luciano recognized that perception often mattered more than direct action. By cultivating relationships with sympathetic officials, maintaining plausible deniability, and controlling information, he reduced the risk of interference. His alliances were not limited to the Mafia. They extended into unions, docks, and even political spheres, creating a web of influence that reinforced his power. Every interaction, every negotiation, and every calculated move contributed to a delicate balance of fear, respect, and dependency. The psychological dimension of these relationships cannot be overstated. Luciano understood that men acted based on both rational calculation and emotional impulse. He used this insight to manipulate allies and rivals alike. By appearing calm, confident, and unassailable, he projected authority even in moments of uncertainty. By rewarding loyalty and punishing defiance selectively, he created a culture where obedience was rational, betrayal was costly, and ambition could flourish only under his guidance. In this environment, men were incentivized to act in the best interests of the organization, aligning their personal goals with Luciano's strategic objectives. Trust, however, was always tested. Within his own organization, subordinates occasionally plotted against him, influenced by ambition, jealousy, or outside pressure. Luciano anticipated these threats, monitoring the behavior of key figures and using intermediaries to gather intelligence. By understanding both the psychology of his men and the dynamics of his rivals, he stayed several moves ahead. This vigilance allowed him to neutralize threats before they could destabilize the system, reinforcing both his authority and the perception of his omnipotence. Rival mobsters were a constant concern. Some, like Dutch Schultz, represented unpredictable dangers, combining ambition with volatility. Others, like Vito Genovese, were patient and calculating, willing to wait years for the right moment to strike. Luciano's genius lay in treating each relationship as a strategic puzzle, weighing loyalty against ambition, fear against incentive, and timing against opportunity. This approach allowed him to navigate a world filled with shifting alliances, constant threats, and inevitable betrayal with remarkable consistency. Perhaps most importantly, Luciano recognized the broader context of power. The Mafia did not exist in isolation. It was part of a larger ecosystem of influence that included politics, law enforcement, business, and labor. By positioning himself at the center of this network, he ensured that his alliances and rivalries had ripple effects far beyond the streets. A loyal operative could enforce control over the docks, influence union decisions, or manipulate public perception. Conversely, an enemy's defiance could be countered with legal pressure, financial leverage, or strategic intimidation. Luciano's understanding of these interconnections elevated his role from street boss to architect of an entire system of power. In the end, the interplay of allies and enemies defined Luciano's rise. He cultivated relationships with precision, manipulated perception, and maintained control through a careful blend of fear, loyalty, and reward. Rivalries were neutralized, alliances strengthened, and his empire expanded without the constant chaos that had plagued earlier generations. By managing human relationships with the same discipline and strategic vision he applied to business operations, Luciano transformed the Mafia from a fractured collection of gangs into a cohesive, profitable, and psychologically disciplined organization. It was this mastery of alliances and rivalries that allowed him to survive crises that would have destroyed others, to extend his influence beyond his immediate environment, and to consolidate power in a way that reshaped the underworld forever. Allies became instruments of strategy, enemies became predictable variables, and the entire landscape of organized crime fell under the careful architecture of a man who understood that power is never static. It must be constantly negotiated, maintained, and defended. Even as Luciano consolidated power and structured his empire, the underworld remained a battlefield where threats emerged not only from rivals but from unseen forces, law enforcement, federal investigations, and the ever-present danger of betrayal. The streets of New York were no longer chaotic in the same way, but the stakes had risen exponentially. Now, every decision carried consequences far beyond a single neighborhood or crew. The Mafia's success had drawn attention, and with visibility came vulnerability. The hidden war of intelligence, influence, and survival had begun. A war fought not only with guns but with strategy, foresight, and manipulation of every element of power. Government scrutiny intensified in the 1930s. Prohibition had ended, but the structures it had created, organized criminal networks, corrupt officials, and highly profitable operations, remained. Law enforcement agencies, from the NYPD to federal prosecutors, were increasingly focused on dismantling the syndicates that dominated vice, labor, and the waterfront. They knew that taking down high-ranking mobsters could disrupt entire networks, but the Mafia had grown sophisticated. Luciano anticipated these pressures, creating layers of intermediaries, front men, and plausible deniability that insulated him from direct involvement. The battle between state and syndicate was no longer immediate or violent. It was a war of maneuver, patience, and intelligence. Luciano's approach to survival was methodical. He understood that brute force alone could not protect his empire. Foresight and calculated risk were essential. He monitored federal investigations, tracked informants, and maintained a network of loyal operatives who fed him intelligence from both law enforcement and rival factions. Every potential vulnerability was examined, and contingencies were established to neutralize threats before they could escalate. His psychological acumen allowed him to anticipate the behavior of both allies and enemies, predicting reactions to pressure, betrayal, and opportunity. This strategic mindset kept him several steps ahead of those who sought to destroy him. Internally, the Mafia faced constant tension. Rivalries did not disappear overnight. Ambitious subordinates, jealous of Luciano's rise, tested boundaries, seeking to assert influence or secure personal gain. He managed these tensions with a combination of negotiation, strategic concessions, and, when necessary, ruthless elimination. Violence was never gratuitous. It was a tool applied to maintain stability, enforce rules, and deter future threats. Every act of aggression sent a clear psychological message. Disloyalty and defiance would be met with swift and inevitable consequences. In this way, Luciano maintained order even when the organization faced internal turbulence. The hidden war also extended to rival families who had survived the Castellamarese upheaval. While Luciano had successfully orchestrated the removal of Masuria and Maranzano, other ambitious figures sought to test the new order. Some saw openings to expand their influence, others to avenge old grudges. Luciano's ability to maintain dominance relied on constant vigilance. He mediated disputes, reinforced alliances, and, when necessary, eliminated threats with precision. Each intervention reinforced his authority and reminded allies and rivals alike that while he was pragmatic, he was also unyielding. Beyond immediate rivalries, Luciano understood the broader strategic environment. The Mafia was deeply intertwined with unions, shipping companies, and other business interests that extended far beyond the city. Disruption in these sectors could threaten profits and influence. Luciano's operations required coordination across multiple domains: labor, gambling, smuggling, and political connections. Each sector had its own risks, and failure in one area could cascade through the entire empire. The hidden war was therefore multidimensional, encompassing economics, psychology, politics, and enforcement, all of which demanded constant attention and intervention. A critical component of his strategy was intelligence. Luciano maintained a network of informants, intermediaries, and trusted lieutenants who provided insight into rival movements, law enforcement activities, and potential betrayals. He understood that information was power and that knowledge allowed preemption. By controlling the flow of intelligence, he could manipulate decisions, anticipate threats, and act decisively without appearing overtly aggressive. In many ways, Luciano's genius was less about force and more about foresight, turning potential vulnerabilities into strategic advantages. Political influence played an equally vital role. Luciano recognized that corruption, when managed carefully, could serve as both a shield and a weapon. Bribed officials could delay investigations, protect shipments, and provide intelligence on rivals. Politicians, eager for campaign contributions and public support, often ignored criminal activity as long as the benefits were substantial. By integrating these relationships into his broader strategy, Luciano ensured that the Mafia's operations could continue with relative impunity, even under intense scrutiny. His empire was protected not only by loyalty and fear within the organization but by strategic alliances with power structures outside it. Psychology remained at the heart of his strategy. The hidden war was as much about perception as reality. Allies needed to believe in the inevitability of his control, rivals needed to respect the cost of defiance, and law enforcement needed to perceive limits to their influence. Luciano orchestrated carefully curated displays of power and restraint, sending signals that were interpreted, feared, and respected across the criminal landscape. Each action, each meeting, each elimination was part of a psychological campaign designed to maintain equilibrium, discourage rebellion, and consolidate authority. Survival in this environment required constant adaptation. Laws changed, alliances shifted, and threats emerged unpredictably. Luciano's genius lay in his flexibility. He could pivot between diplomacy and violence, between subtle manipulation and direct action, depending on the needs of the moment. This adaptability allowed him to maintain dominance not through brute force alone but through a dynamic understanding of human behavior, opportunity, and consequence. The hidden war was ongoing, unseen by the public, but it shaped every aspect of life within the Mafia and ensured the resilience of Luciano's empire. In the end, the hidden war demonstrated the true scope of Luciano's vision and strategic acumen. He had transformed the Mafia from a violent, chaotic network into a disciplined, intelligent, and resilient organization capable of weathering both internal and external threats. Through intelligence, psychological insight, political leverage, and careful management of violence, he created an empire that operated seamlessly, even under the pressures of constant scrutiny and threat. The battles he fought were rarely visible, but they were decisive, and they ensured that his power remained unchallenged, at least for a time. Even the most brilliant architect of power is vulnerable to the forces of fate, and for Lucky Luciano, the fall began not with a rival's gun but with the law he had long outsmarted. Despite his careful planning, the system he had built relied on secrecy, intermediaries, and the assumption that loyalty and fear would always hold. Yet the very visibility of his empire, its success, its scope, its audacity, had drawn attention that could no longer be ignored. Federal agents, prosecutors, and investigators were closing in, focusing on illicit operations that extended from gambling dens to prostitution rings, docks, and labor rackets. The empire that had seemed invincible was now under a microscope, and Luciano would discover that control was never absolute. The first cracks appeared in the form of targeted raids and sting operations. Law enforcement, emboldened by public pressure and new investigative techniques, began piecing together the intricate web of crime Luciano had orchestrated. Informants emerged, some coerced, others motivated by self-interest, and they exposed elements of the system that even Luciano had thought secure. Every detail mattered: the wrong word, a single careless transaction, a misjudged alliance, and suddenly the invisible structures of his empire were exposed to scrutiny. For a man who had built his power on foresight and psychological insight, this was a test unlike any other. Betrayal, the constant shadow in his life, struck with calculated timing. Some of his closest associates, whether seeking leniency or acting out of ambition, began cooperating with authorities. The very loyalty that had fortified his rise now became the source of vulnerability. Luciano had long relied on the fear of reprisal to secure obedience, but the law operated on a different calculus. Prison time, immunity deals, and the promise of protection could override fear of mob retribution. For the first time, Luciano confronted a reality in which strategy alone could not guarantee survival. Human behavior, under external pressure, could fracture even the most disciplined organization. The arrests began systematically. High-ranking lieutenants, street-level operatives, and peripheral associates were detained, interrogated, and in some cases turned informants. Each arrest was a shockwave through the organization, destabilizing operations, sowing mistrust, and testing the resilience of the hierarchy Luciano had so carefully constructed. His authority, once absolute, now faced challenges from multiple fronts. Men who had once acted predictably under his guidance now acted out of fear for themselves, creating uncertainty and vulnerability within the ranks. The hidden war had become visible, and the pressures of survival were now immediate and personal. Luciano himself became a target of intensive investigation. Federal agents, state police, and city detectives coordinated efforts to connect him directly to the crimes that had enriched and empowered his empire. They combed through financial records, interrogated associates, and followed leads with relentless precision. For the first time, Luciano experienced the weight of vulnerability on a scale that matched his previous dominance. No amount of planning could fully mitigate the risk posed by the confluence of law enforcement pressure, informants, and the inherent unpredictability of human behavior. His fall, once distant in theory, now loomed imminent and unavoidable. The psychological impact on Luciano was profound. A man who had spent his life anticipating betrayal, manipulating perception, and controlling outcomes now faced circumstances that were increasingly beyond his influence. His instincts, honed over decades of strategic calculation, were tested in ways that demanded adaptation, restraint, and rapid decision-making. He became acutely aware that survival required both the application of skill and acceptance of vulnerability. The streets, once predictable through a matrix of fear and loyalty, now posed threats that could not be entirely controlled. Internal pressures compounded external ones. Subordinates, sensing weakness, began to hedge their positions, quietly testing the limits of their loyalty. Alliances that had once seemed unshakable were strained by uncertainty, and the specter of betrayal became more tangible than ever. Luciano's carefully maintained equilibrium, an empire built on psychological control, fear, and opportunity, was challenged by the very human reactions to imminent risk. His leadership, which had relied on perception and foresight, was now subjected to the unpredictable forces of panic, self-preservation, and opportunism. The public narrative intensified the pressure. Media coverage of Mafia operations, sensationalized and dramatic, amplified the perception of criminal omnipresence while casting Luciano as the mastermind of a sprawling and dangerous network. Public outrage fueled law enforcement determination, creating a feedback loop in which scrutiny intensified operational vulnerability. Even men who had once been loyal found themselves navigating a landscape where fear of incarceration or exposure could outweigh traditional obligations. The empire that had thrived in secrecy now contended with the full weight of public, legal, and organizational pressure. Luciano's fall was not a single event but a series of escalating crises. Investigations led to arrests, arrests led to revelations, and revelations destabilized the organization. Each crisis required swift adaptation, strategic removals, relocation of operations, and careful management of human resources. Yet despite his skill and foresight, the cumulative effect of these pressures was destabilizing. The psychological weight of facing both legal and internal threats forced Luciano into a reactive posture, an unusual position for a man who had long dictated the terms of engagement. Ultimately, the fall of Luciano was as much about circumstance as it was about miscalculation. He had built an empire that had surpassed the capacity of traditional law enforcement to comprehend, but that very complexity became its vulnerability. The interconnectedness of operations, the reliance on human intermediaries, and the visibility of wealth and influence created points of exposure. In attempting to control every aspect of his world, he had also created a network that, once infiltrated, could unravel quickly. The beginning of his downfall was a reminder that even the most meticulous strategy is vulnerable to the unpredictable variables of law, loyalty, and human ambition. Even in this period of decline, Luciano's response demonstrated the resilience and adaptability that had defined his rise. He maneuvered to minimize damage, protect key allies, and maintain operational continuity where possible. Yet the reality of arrest and exposure was undeniable. The fall had begun, a slow, methodical erosion of power that would test every lesson he had learned about loyalty, psychology, and strategy. The empire he had built, once seemingly invincible, now faced the ultimate challenge: survival under pressure, both from outside forces and from within. The courtroom became the stage upon which Luciano's empire, meticulously constructed over decades, faced its most public and unforgiving test. Unlike the hidden war of intelligence, intimidation, and influence that had defined his rise, the trial brought him into the harsh glare of legal scrutiny and public attention. Prosecutors, emboldened by public outrage and fed by the testimonies of former allies, sought to dismantle the carefully orchestrated network he had built. Every detail of his operations, from gambling rings to prostitution, from labor rackets to smuggling, was dissected, analyzed, and presented as evidence of a man who had engineered the city's criminal underworld with precision and audacity. The media turned the trial into a spectacle. Newspapers, radio programs, and gossip columns cast Luciano as both mastermind and villain, painting him as a symbol of organized crime's reach and ruthlessness. Public fascination blended with fear. The narrative framed him as both a criminal genius and an existential threat to societal order. Headlines proclaimed his influence over the docks, his manipulation of unions, and his orchestration of nationwide illicit enterprises. In this environment, the trial was as much about perception as about legal facts. Luciano understood this implicitly. He had always operated in the intersection of psychology, fear, and influence, but here the stakes were different. Every word spoken, every reaction observed, had consequences that extended far beyond the courtroom. Luciano's strategy in court reflected the same calculated thinking that had governed his rise. He relied on layers of intermediaries and plausible deniability, distancing himself from direct involvement in operations while maintaining control behind the scenes. Defense attorneys worked tirelessly to undermine the credibility of witnesses, discredit testimonies, and exploit inconsistencies in the prosecution's narrative. Yet the courtroom environment was inherently perilous. Once the veil of secrecy was lifted, the meticulously concealed operations and alliances could be scrutinized and interpreted in ways that left him vulnerable. The trial revealed the fragility of loyalty in the face of legal pressure. Former allies, some of whom had benefited enormously from his guidance and protection, now testified against him in exchange for leniency or immunity. The very code of omerta that had protected the organization for decades was tested in the crucible of the judicial system. Fear of retribution from Luciano or his network could not outweigh the promise of reduced sentences or protection from prosecution. The human calculus that had enabled his empire to function efficiently, loyalty reinforced by fear and reward, was suddenly disrupted by the mechanisms of law. Witnesses painted a portrait of Luciano as both brilliant and ruthless. They described the orchestration of the Mafia commission, the consolidation of criminal enterprises, and the meticulous management of operations across the city and beyond. Each narrative reinforced the prosecution's argument that Luciano was not merely a participant in criminal activity but the architect of an organized, sophisticated, and highly profitable criminal empire. Yet beneath the headlines and testimonies, there was a psychological drama unfolding. Luciano's demeanor, calculated expressions, and subtle interactions with lawyers and court officials projected a controlled calm, signaling both defiance and resilience. The trial also exposed the broader consequences of power and ambition. Prosecutors framed Luciano's operations not merely as individual crimes but as systemic threats, emphasizing how the Mafia had infiltrated industries, unions, and even political structures. This framing amplified the perceived stakes. The courtroom became a theater in which not only Luciano's fate but the fate of New York's underworld and public confidence in law enforcement hung in the balance. Each question posed, each objection raised, and each piece of evidence introduced added tension to a narrative that intertwined strategy, morality, and psychological control. Despite the pressure, Luciano remained strategically aware. He leveraged media attention, courtroom theatrics, and his reputation to project an image of resilience. Observers noted his composure, his ability to anticipate prosecution strategies, and his careful management of personal interactions. Even as the legal machinery closed in, he demonstrated the same strategic thinking that had allowed him to rise through the chaos of gang wars, rivalries, and internal conflicts. The courtroom became an extension of his broader approach, a place where psychology, perception, and manipulation were as critical as evidence and law. The sentence that followed was a turning point. Despite the brilliance of his defense and the charisma he displayed, Luciano was found guilty of charges relating to organized prostitution and racketeering. The verdict marked the beginning of a tangible, irreversible decline in his freedom and autonomy. It was a moment that contrasted sharply with the years of calculated expansion, psychological control, and operational mastery. The fall from influence, which had been gradual and largely unseen during his rise, now became undeniable and public. The empire he had built remained, but its architect was constrained, forced to navigate a new reality defined by bars, court orders, and constant surveillance. Yet even in this period of legal defeat, Luciano's influence persisted. His understanding of human behavior and organizational dynamics allowed him to maintain connections, manage operations from afar, and protect loyal allies. While the courtroom had stripped him of physical freedom, it had not entirely dismantled his authority. The trial underscored a central truth of his life. Power is never absolute, but it can endure when built on a foundation of loyalty, fear, strategy, and perception. The trial also left an indelible mark on public consciousness. It framed the Mafia as a national concern, highlighted the challenges of prosecuting organized crime, and demonstrated the limits of law enforcement against highly sophisticated networks. For Luciano personally, it was both a humbling and defining moment. He faced the consequences of his actions, yet his ability to influence, strategize, and anticipate ensured that his legacy would continue. The courtroom, with its legalities, testimonies, and media scrutiny, became a stage on which the consequences of ambition, strategy, and human behavior played out with cinematic intensity, signaling the transition from dominance to the complex interplay of decline and adaptation. In the end, the trial and sentencing of Lucky Luciano were more than legal events. They were the psychological and operational climax of decades of calculated expansion, strategic alliance building, and the meticulous orchestration of both human and criminal networks. It was a moment that juxtaposed brilliance with vulnerability, control with constraint, and perception with reality. The empire he had constructed endured beyond the courtroom, but its leader had been confronted with the consequences of his audacity. The stage was set for the next chapter of his life, a chapter that would test the resilience, adaptability, and enduring influence of a man who had always operated several moves ahead of those around him. Even behind bars, Lucky Luciano's influence refused to wane. Prison walls, iron bars, and the constant gaze of wardens were obstacles to the body, but they could not entirely contain the mind that had orchestrated one of the most sophisticated criminal empires in history. While many assumed that incarceration would signify the end of his power, Luciano demonstrated that authority is not always defined by physical presence. Control, he understood, was as much about perception, loyalty, and strategic influence as it was about immediate action. From within his cell, he continued to shape events, orchestrate decisions, and maintain the threads of an empire that extended far beyond the prison walls. The prison environment itself became a microcosm of the broader world Luciano had mastered. Inmates were organized along familiar lines. Factions, loyalties, and rivalries all reflected the structure of the streets he had once dominated. Luciano quickly assessed the psychological landscape, identifying influential figures and potential allies, as well as threats who could destabilize the delicate balance of power. Through careful observation and subtle manipulation, he established a network of influence within the prison, using trusted intermediaries to relay orders, gather information, and maintain connections with the outside world. In essence, he recreated the psychological architecture of his empire within confinement. Luciano's ability to operate from prison relied on intermediaries who were deeply loyal and highly competent. These men acted as extensions of his will, managing day-to-day operations, enforcing discipline, and reporting back intelligence on both internal dynamics and external threats. By delegating effectively, he ensured that his absence did not disrupt the structure of his network. Each operative understood that obedience was both a reward and a necessity, and Luciano's reputation alone was sufficient to maintain compliance. Fear, respect, and incentive, tools he had refined over decades, remained just as potent behind bars as they had on the streets. Psychologically, incarceration presented a new set of challenges and opportunities. Luciano recognized that the perception of control was often as powerful as control itself. He cultivated an image of calm authority, projecting confidence in interactions with both guards and fellow inmates. Even subtle gestures, a measured word, a deliberate act of generosity, or a quiet warning, reinforced his presence and influence. Men around him, aware of his history and capabilities, deferred to his judgment, understood the consequences of defiance, and recognized the strategic advantages of loyalty. In this environment, perception became a weapon, and Luciano wielded it masterfully. Communication with the outside world was critical. Letters, visitors, and controlled interactions with trusted intermediaries allowed Luciano to continue directing operations, negotiating disputes, and shaping alliances. Every message was carefully calibrated to convey authority, manage risk, and maintain coherence across his network. He understood that even a slight misstep, a misinterpreted instruction, a breach of trust, or exposure to law enforcement scrutiny, could have cascading effects. Thus, precision in communication became both a survival tactic and a method of sustaining influence. Beyond operational management, Luciano also understood the symbolic power of his continued presence in the lives of his associates. His imprisonment served as both a cautionary tale and a reminder of the consequences of ambition. Loyal operatives were motivated not only by opportunity but by the desire to align themselves with a figure whose intellect, foresight, and strategic prowess remained unchallenged. Enemies, conversely, were reminded of the reach of a man whose influence extended far beyond physical freedom. By sustaining his aura of authority, Luciano transformed incarceration from a limitation into an instrument of psychological control. Luciano's interactions with law enforcement, prison officials, and government agents further highlighted his strategic adaptability. He recognized that negotiation, compromise, and cooperation could yield opportunities even in confinement. By positioning himself as indispensable in certain contexts, whether in managing prisoner behavior, offering insight into criminal networks, or assisting with broader law enforcement initiatives, he created leverage that could protect his interests and extend his influence. In this way, prison became not merely a site of punishment but a strategic arena in which power could be exercised in unconventional ways. Maintaining control over the broader empire required both patience and foresight. Luciano had to anticipate the actions of rivals, monitor internal shifts, and adjust strategies to respond to emerging threats. The decentralized nature of his operations demanded careful oversight, and he relied heavily on intelligence networks to ensure decisions were informed and timely. Even small lapses could have amplified consequences, yet Luciano's ability to predict behavior, assess risk, and act strategically allowed him to maintain a degree of operational continuity that many assumed was impossible for a prisoner. The psychological endurance required to maintain influence from prison cannot be overstated. Luciano faced isolation, threats, and the constant reminder of vulnerability, yet he adapted, recalibrated, and persisted. He demonstrated that leadership was not merely about visibility or direct enforcement but about the creation of systems, the management of perception, and the orchestration of human behavior. Through this lens, his prison years were an extension of the skills that had defined his rise: intelligence, strategic insight, and psychological mastery. Even as external pressures mounted, Luciano's ability to navigate the environment ensured that the empire he had built did not collapse in his absence. Subordinates continued operations, alliances were preserved, and the broader network remained resilient. In a sense, incarceration tested the durability of his methods. It was a crucible in which the principles of loyalty, fear, incentive, and perception were subjected to the harshest conditions. That they endured is a testament to the sophistication and foresight of Luciano's approach. Ultimately, the period behind bars highlighted a central truth. True power is not defined solely by freedom or proximity. It is defined by influence, strategy, and the ability to orchestrate outcomes even under constraints. Luciano's control from prison reinforced his status as a master strategist, a manipulator of perception, and an architect of human behavior. While he was physically confined, his reach remained extensive, and his ability to shape events, maintain alliances, and influence rivals ensured that he retained a level of authority that few could challenge. Through this lens, Luciano's years behind bars were not merely a period of decline, they were an extension of his empire, a testament to the durability of psychological control, and a demonstration of how intellect and strategy can transcend physical limitations. Prison walls could not contain his influence, and even in confinement he continued to wield power in ways that would shape organized crime for decades to come. After years of controlling the underworld from both the streets and behind bars, Lucky Luciano faced a new chapter that would test the limits of his adaptability: exile. The government, recognizing both his influence and the impossibility of containing him entirely through imprisonment, decided to deport him to Italy. For many, this would have been the ultimate fall, a permanent removal from the networks he had built, the streets he had dominated, and the empire he had meticulously orchestrated. But Luciano approached exile as he had approached every challenge in his life, as an opportunity to wield influence, maneuver strategically, and maintain a degree of control even in an unfamiliar environment. Landing in Naples, Italy in the early 1940s, Luciano was thrust into a world both familiar and alien. He returned to a country he had left decades earlier as a young immigrant, but Italy had changed and so had he. War raged across Europe, and the political and social landscape was fraught with instability. Luciano, however, was not content to remain a passive observer. He quickly assessed the terrain, identifying individuals, factions, and power dynamics that could be leveraged. His exile, rather than being a total loss, became a testing ground for his strategic genius in a new context, a place where influence could be reconstructed even under surveillance and scrutiny. The American authorities, while removing him physically from the country, underestimated his capacity for indirect control. Through intermediaries, letters, and carefully placed allies, Luciano continued to exert influence over his American operations. Trusted lieutenants acted as extensions of his will, carrying out his directives and ensuring that the empire he had built did not collapse in his absence. The illusion of distance masked the reality of ongoing coordination. Luciano's understanding of organizational psychology allowed him to maintain loyalty across thousands of miles, proving that authority was as much about perception as it was about presence. Italy also provided Luciano with new opportunities to maneuver strategically on the global stage. He leveraged contacts in shipping, trade, and local criminal organizations to maintain financial influence and extend his reach. While the structures of power were different, the principles were the same: build alliances, manage perception, enforce loyalty, and exploit opportunity. His adaptability allowed him to navigate Italian society with the same precision he had once applied to New York, blending diplomacy with the threat of force, and negotiation with psychological manipulation. The geopolitical context added complexity to Luciano's strategies. During World War II, the Allied invasion of Italy presented both risks and possibilities. Luciano, ever pragmatic, recognized the value of positioning himself as a resource for American interests. Reports suggest he provided intelligence and guidance regarding port security and Mafia networks, offering his expertise in exchange for leniency and improved standing. By aligning strategically with powerful external forces, Luciano transformed exile from punishment into leverage. Even as he remained physically constrained by government decisions, he carved out influence in ways that few expected, demonstrating the remarkable flexibility of his approach to power. Exile also forced Luciano to reflect on the nature of his life, his empire, and the consequences of decades of ambition. Removed from the immediacy of his empire's operations, he had time to assess the fragility of human loyalty, the weight of strategic foresight, and the inevitability of vulnerability. It was a period that blended action with introspection, as he considered both the practical and philosophical dimensions of leadership, control, and human behavior. In many ways, exile became a crucible of understanding, revealing the limits of influence, the power of perception, and the adaptability required to survive in a world that could no longer be dominated solely by force or intimidation. Maintaining relevance required careful navigation of both local and international relationships. Luciano cultivated allies among Italian criminal organizations, politicians, and businessmen, ensuring that his exile did not render him irrelevant. By projecting authority and leveraging reputation, he created networks that allowed him to influence not only the underworld but also legitimate economic and political channels. His skill in translating psychological insight into practical leverage ensured that he remained a figure of power, even in a context that might have diminished lesser men. Exile also highlighted the enduring tension between power and constraint. Luciano's freedom of movement was limited, his direct control over American operations diminished, and the environment was rife with unpredictable variables, from political instability to rival factions. Yet, within these constraints he found opportunities to assert influence, negotiate strategically, and shape outcomes. He demonstrated that true leadership is not confined to geography or circumstance but resides in the ability to understand systems, anticipate behavior, and manipulate perception effectively. The years in Italy also allowed Luciano to reconcile to some degree with his own legacy. He had survived wars, rivalries, imprisonments, and betrayals, and exile became a moment to evaluate the architecture of his empire and the psychological mechanisms that had sustained it. He understood that influence is resilient when grounded in loyalty, fear, incentive, and strategic foresight. Even as the American authorities sought to diminish his power through deportation, Luciano proved that influence can transcend borders, and that the psychological structures of control are often more enduring than physical proximity. Ultimately, exile was not the end of Luciano's story but a transformation of it. He shifted from direct leadership to strategic influence, from operational command to psychological and structural control, and from public visibility to the subtle exercise of power behind the scenes. By navigating this chapter with intelligence, adaptability, and foresight, Luciano reinforced the lessons that had defined his life: that power is multidimensional, survival requires flexibility, and influence extends far beyond the immediate realm of control. Through exile, Luciano demonstrated that even in apparent defeat, a mind capable of strategy, foresight, and psychological mastery can continue to shape outcomes. The narrative of loss was, in his hands, transformed into a narrative of adaptation, survival, and enduring influence, a testament to the resilience of a man who had understood the mechanics of power more deeply than almost anyone before or since. Lucky Luciano's legacy is one of profound influence, a mix of brilliance, ruthlessness, and strategic mastery. He transformed the chaotic, fragmented world of organized crime into a structured, disciplined network. Before him, gangs operated largely through violence and tradition. After him, the Mafia became a system governed by rules, hierarchy, and a central authority. The creation of the Mafia Commission was his most significant innovation, institutionalizing decision-making and conflict resolution, reducing internal bloodshed, and allowing multiple families to operate under a shared framework. This system not only stabilized organized crime in New York but became a model followed nationally and internationally. Luciano's genius lay in understanding human behavior. He knew that loyalty could be earned, fear could be leveraged, and perception could be as powerful as direct control. He cultivated alliances carefully, rewarding those who supported him and neutralizing those who threatened his authority. Partners like Meyer Lansky and Bugsy Siegel exemplified his pragmatic approach. Relationships were strategic, mutually beneficial, and conditional. In doing so, Luciano demonstrated that leadership in the underworld was less about domination and more about orchestration, coordinating people, resources, and influence to maintain power. He also transformed criminal enterprises into highly organized businesses. Gambling, prostitution, labor rackets, and smuggling were managed with efficiency, discipline, and foresight, turning opportunistic crimes into sustainable, profitable operations. This approach changed the way law enforcement and society understood organized crime. Luciano's influence extended beyond operations. It shaped the culture, strategy, and psychology of the underworld. Even from prison and later in exile, his control persisted through loyal intermediaries, strategic communication, and the enduring structures he had put in place. Luciano's life illustrates the interplay of power, strategy, and human psychology. His methods, combining foresight, perception, and manipulation, created an empire that survived even as he faced legal and geographic constraints. The myth of Lucky Luciano often emphasizes audacity and violence, but his true legacy lies in the structural and psychological sophistication of his empire. He left behind lessons in leadership, influence, and adaptability that endure far beyond the criminal world, a testament to the enduring power of intellect and strategic mastery. The final chapter of Lucky Luciano's life is a study in contrast, where myth meets reality. Exile removed him from the streets and operations he had dominated, yet his influence remained pervasive. Even without direct control, the structures and systems he had built, the Mafia Commission, organized alliances, and disciplined networks, continued to shape organized crime in New York and beyond. His genius lay not in mere brute force but in foresight, strategy, and the orchestration of human behavior, which allowed his empire to endure even in his absence. In exile, Luciano reflected on the legacy of his actions. He had transformed a chaotic, fragmented underworld into a disciplined and efficient network. His methods, combining loyalty, fear, negotiation, and strategic enforcement, set a blueprint for generations to follow. While the world saw the myth of a ruthless criminal mastermind, the reality was a man who understood the psychology of power and the importance of systems that outlive individual actors. Luciano also recognized that power is relational. His authority was maintained through perception, reputation, and careful guidance of his successors, demonstrating that influence is often more enduring than physical presence. The interplay of loyalty, manipulation, and foresight ensured that his strategies continued to operate even when he was removed from the epicenter of action. Ultimately, Luciano's final years offer a lesson in resilience and adaptation. Even in exile, with freedom constrained and health declining, he demonstrated that leadership is about strategic insight, the management of human behavior, and building structures capable of enduring beyond oneself. The myth and the man converge here. A figure both feared and admired, whose legacy in organized crime and criminal psychology remains profound.